Access to safe drinking water for all people is a declared fundamental goal in various policies of the global development community. But for 2015, still 672 million people are expected to have no access to safe drinking water. The overwhelming majority of the people without access to safe water live in rural areas. In many developing countries, the public sector has failed to provide safe water to all. Their water sectors have become the playground of a wide range of interests, from local to international NGOs, donor countries and their agencies, private companies, and local to transnational elites. So what is the role of NGOs in that context? There are different opinions.
Civil society NGOs are very important to allow private sector and government function well within a certain agreed rules.
And then what you would like to see happening in a PPP, for example, that is genuine, geared towards better water provision, you would want, as an NGO, you would want to work to increase the skills and the capabilities of local people to influence and monitor processes. And if I were a private company that would invest in that kind of PPP, I would want NGOs to do that, because it would assure me that I have less conflicts and better provision and in the end earn more money.
The NGOs can be assisting private sector in, first of all, voicing the needs from the consumers.
When private sector participation is increasing, can NGOs and private companies be equal partners in development cooperation?
Private sector is always greedy. They want to do their things, and the government has to control them.
They are based on criteria that do not reflect the needs of poor people, then we would lobby against it, because it would take money from development cooperation for means that are not linked to development cooperation, which I think is wrong, basically.
Private companies are assumed to be more efficient and to be more rigid with their cost recovery strategies. But can they also bring benefit to those regions most in need, for the poorest people, especially in the rural areas? And what is the benefit of NGOs for those that have no access yet? This documentary is about how private companies and how NGOs can bring benefit to those regions most in need, for the poorest people, especially in the rural areas. Policies on development cooperation of Western governments change with the political parties in power and are influenced by the global development agenda.
Private sector is the foundation for a sustainable development, as we call it. Our government doesn't believe the government is the foundation for sustainable development. The government should facilitate, should allow, but the main engine is private sector.
The new Dutch policy on international development cooperation has declared water as a priority. The promotion of the private sector in development cooperation follows a global trend and has increasingly been practiced in recent years. There are different interpretations of the policy with regard to the promotion of the private sector.
If you look at the current policy, the government is trying to encourage the participation of the private sector, and it wants the private sector to invest heavily in development cooperation projects, but it also wants the private sector to benefit from such projects. So that's what they really want.
Government's policy is not to promote private sector participation. The government's policy is to achieve certain objectives in the water sector, and they think that the private sector is part of the group of actors helping them to reach that objective.
On one hand, governments often failed to provide water services for all after decolonialization. And also the ideologies on what the public sector should provide has changed over time. Today, the private sector participation is seen as an instrument to improve the efficiency and service quality of utilities.
A healthy private sector is key to the development of a country. Government is not able to do what they ought to be doing. So then the private sector thinks they can better do it. So they get together and they form a group. Maybe they get some money from somewhere and they carry out tasks that actually should have been done by the government. Private sector men are like this, I for one, making money, and the government officials use.
But when water services are seen as a key public service, private sector involvement in the water sector is often controversial. From empirical research, there is evidence that privatization leads to increased productivity and efficiency, but there is very little on how this helps reducing poverty or contributes to increased coverage for the poor. About 84% of the people without access to safe water live in rural areas, especially in fragile and the least developed countries.
I think the role of private sector is more limited, is smaller in general, if you want to generalize. So I think in many of those fragile states there's a bigger role for NGOs in a traditional way of implementing facilities or capacity building. And I think the role of private sector is much more difficult.
The question is whether the private sector can make its profits out of providing water to the poorest people in the world. And I have personally my doubts.
However, it is not clear which private sector is targeted by the new Dutch policy, the one in developing countries or the one in the Netherlands. The OECD has expressed concern that private sector development remains clearly distinguished and separate from the promotion of Dutch commercial interests. A very common way for the private sector to engage in developing countries today are so-called public-private partnerships, PPPs. These are collaborations between the public sector and the private sector entity, where each party shares risks, responsibilities and sometimes also the investments. In the literature, PPPs are also described as a trend towards repackaging privatization, a strategy that has learned from the failure of the privatization of water utilities in the 1990s.
The public-private partnership is not just only here, it's very much in the South, in the Africans or in the Asian or in the Latin American countries. So it's not only the private sector of the Netherlands, it's also very much the private sector of those countries. And I think that's an important element.
Non-governmental organizations called NGOs and private sector companies are fundamentally different in their organizational settings and strategies.
It's very different when you talk about private sector investment. If I'm a private sector company and I want to go and do an investment somewhere, I look for a like-minded person wherever in the world I may find. And then I try to develop that relationship. I'm not bound by a choice of country that has been predetermined by somebody else. So I'm looking for a partner with the same sort of intellectual commitment and ideas. In development cooperation, you have one person or one party very rich who has this notion of trying to improve the life of another person, but based on his perceptions of what the other person wants improved. And that's where the problem lies.
Now you see, we see NGO as a key element of society. You see, to build a society. This is what we call civil society. Civil society between the people and the government. NGOs can speak to the politicians and they listen to them because NGOs have good contact with the people and these people will be voting. And so they are important for politicians to listen to.
Local and international NGOs have an important role to represent the interests of civil society. They can act as watchdogs and can contribute to improved governance, which has proved important for sustainable solutions. Also, NGOs can be of benefit for the private sector.
So they have an NGO who are there to help the consumers to get their rights. So they are more advocacy.
Some public companies are probably better than public institutions. But it's all, the basic condition is the public remains in control over what happens to the water provision. And if whether that, and the problem is that in many developing countries this public control doesn't exist. And then privatization is a huge problem because prices might increase, they might still not do what they promised, they will, go away once their profits will be less than they expected. So there's no, where the governance part is much more important than the who does what part.
The culture is very specific, it's very peculiar. NGOs are often open for cultural elements. Dutch private sector or European private sector, northern private sector I would say, come with a certain Yeah, we know what the solution is. Often I can say that private sector does not see the added value of an NGO. They find them too soft, they find them not business oriented, or they don't find them that they are cost effective or cost conscious. So they think, okay, this is nice, but it costs a lot of money and it doesn't really lead to a result.
And then what you would like to see happening in a PPP, for example, that is genuine, geared towards better water provision, you would want, as an NGO, you would want to work to increase the skills and the capabilities of local people to influence and monitor processes. And if I were a private company that would invest in that kind of PPP, I would want NGOs to do that, because it would assure me that I have less conflicts and better provision, and in the end earn more money, basically.
So when looking at those people without access in rural areas, are the NGOs better off to serve them? And is the private sector only suitable for the urban centers?
There are sometimes PPPs possible for a rural setting as well. But then you come to simpler solutions, where there are NGOs who are also a bit more business oriented, who have also ideas on technology improvement, and who can support very much with a business perspective such development in the rural area.
But my gut feeling is, when we are talking about the poorest of the poor, perhaps the NGOs are better able to deal with their concerns, whether in the water field or other field, than businesses.
All people interviewed consider both NGOs and the private sector as important elements to achieve the common goal of access to drinking water for all. But especially where most of the people in need live, in the rural parts of this world, the private sector will need support from NGOs in order to contribute its share.